Chapter 18. As it turned out, that task was a lot easier than either Eric or Halt would have thought possible. Ragnac was many things, but he was no fool. When the small party returned to Hallesholm, bringing news that an army of close to 6,000 Temujai horsemen was in the process of invading his country, he did the same mental arithmetic that Eric had done. He knew as well as Eric that he could muster a force of no more than 1,500 warriors, possibly less, considering that some of the outlying settlements close to the border had probably been overrun and defeated already. Like most Skandians, Ragnac wasn't afraid of dying in battle, but he also didn't believe that one should seek an end without first finding all other alternatives. If there was a way of defeating the invaders, he would examine it. Consequently, when Eric told him of Halt's knowledge of the Temujai and his agreement to lend his services, and when Borsa and several other council members welcomed the idea, he accepted their arguments with no more than token resistance. As for the matter of the recaptured slaves, he dismissed the matter entirely. In normal times he might seek to punish runaways, as a way of discouraging further escapes, but these weren't normal times, and with an invading army at his doorstep, the matter of 2 recaptured slaves was of slight interest to him at best. He did, however, demand to see Halt in his private quarters, and with no one else present. He knew enough about rangers to respect their abilities and their courage as a group, but he wanted the chance to assess this man as an individual. Ragnac's ability to form such evaluations of men had been one of his principal qualities as leader of the Skandians. Evidence of his skill was the fact that he habitually chose Eric to handle the more difficult tasks that went with ruling a nation of independent-minded, argumentative warriors. Halt was shown to the low-ceilinged, timber-lined room where Ragnac spent his private hours, and these days, the Oberjarl noted ruefully, there were precious few of those. The room was like all the senior Skandians' quarters, warmed by a pine log fire, with bearskins furnishing the pine-wood carved furniture, decorated with the polyglot results of years of plundering coastal villages and other ships. The centerpiece of the room was an immense crystal chandelier, taken from an abbey on the coast of the Constant Sea years ago. With no high ceiling to hang it from, Ragnac had chosen to leave it resting on a rough pine table. It dominated the room, and was more than a little awkward in the confined space. Furthermore, in its tabletop position, it was totally incapable of performing its designed intention. There was no way that the 50 small oil lamps could be lit and kept burning safely. But Ragnac loved the piece. To him, it represented art at its highest. It was an object of rare beauty, incongruous as it might be in this setting, and so he left it there. He looked up from a scroll he was reading as Halt knocked at the door and entered, as he was told to do. Ragnac frowned. He equated prowess in battle with physical strength and size. The man before him looked wiry enough, but his head would barely come past the Oberjarl's shoulder if both were standing. There were no 2 ways about it. He was a small man. "So, you're Halt," he said, not sounding too interested in the fact. He saw the little man's right eyebrow rise momentarily. Then the man repeated, in exactly the same tone, "So, you're Ragnac." Ragnac's heavy brows came close together in an expression of anger, but inwardly he felt a quick flicker of respect for the man in front of him. He liked Halt's instant reply, liked the way the ranger was showing no sign of being cowed. "People address me as Oberjarl," he said in an ominous tone. Halt gave just the slightest suggestion of a shrug. "Very well, Oberjarl," he replied. "I'll do the same." Halt studied the Oberjarl with a keen eye. He was huge, but that was fairly normal for Skandians. He didn't have the classic sculptured musculature that a person such as Horus would achieve in the next few years, with broad shoulders and narrow hips. Rather, like all Skandians, he was bulky throughout his entire body, built like a bear. The arms and legs were massively muscled, and the face was bearded, with the long beard lovingly separated into 2 sweeping masses. The hair had been red originally, but now the onset of age was turning it the color of ashes in a cold fireplace. There was a faded scar on one cheek, stretching from just under the left eye down to the point of the man's chin. Halt guessed it to be an old injury. Again, There was little to remark on in this. The Skandians chose their leaders from the ranks of warriors, not administrators. Most of all, Halt noted the eyes. He recognized the dislike that he saw there. He had been expecting to see that. But the eyes were deep-set, and he could read an intelligence and cunning there as well. For that he was grateful. If Ragnac had been a stupid man, Halt's position might well have become untenable here. He knew of the Aubergirl's ingrained dislike for rangers, and he knew the reasons behind it. But an intelligent leader would be aware of Halt's usefulness to him, and might be prepared to set aside his personal dislike for the greater good of his people.
"I have no love for your kind, ranger," the Aubergirl said.
His mind was obviously running on lines similar to Halt's.
"You have no reason to,"
Halt agreed. "But you might well find a use for me."
"So I'm told,"
the Skandian leader replied, once again finding himself admiring the ranger's forthrightness. When he'd first heard of his son's death at Thorntree, Ragnac had been overcome with grief and rage, at Araluans, rangers, and in particular at King Duncan. But that had been an immediate and spontaneous reaction to his grief. A realist, he knew that his son had risked death by joining the ill-fated adventure with Morgoth's forces, and indeed death in battle was commonplace among Skandians, who lived to raid and pillage. As a result, over the intervening months, Ragnac's anger, if not his grief, had faded. His son had died honorably, with a weapon in his hands. That was all any Skandian could ask. That wasn't to say that he felt any affection for rangers, but he could respect their abilities, and their courage, and their worth as opponents. Or even, possibly as allies. Ragnac's vow against King Duncan and his family was another matter altogether. Chances are, had he waited, his hatred might well have abated, and a more reasonable attitude might have prevailed. But, acting on impulse, he had sworn a vow to the Valis, the triple deity who ruled Skandian religion, and that vow was inviolable. Ragnac might be able to accept Halt as an ally. He might be able to recognize that those same qualities that made the ranger a dangerous opponent could also render him a useful confederate in the upcoming battle against the Temujai invaders. That would be his personal choice. But his Valis vow against Duncan was irrevocable.
"So,"
Ragnac said abruptly,
"can you help us?"
Halt answered without any hesitation. "I'm willing to do whatever I can," he said. "What that might be, I have no idea as yet."
"No idea?"
Ragnac repeated scornfully.
"I was told that rangers are always full of ideas."
Halt shook his head. "I need to assess your strengths and weaknesses first, and then I'll need maps of the surrounding countryside," he said. "We'll have to find a spot that will offset the superiority of numbers as far as possible. Then I'm going to ride out for another look at the Temujai. Last time I saw them, I had my hands full keeping your senior Jarl alive. Then, after I've done all that, I might be able to answer your question." Ragnac chewed one end of his mustache, taking in what the ranger had said. He was impressed in spite of himself. His ability to plan for a battle usually amounted to the words, "Everyone ready? Follow me," before he led the way in a frontal assault. Perhaps, he thought, this ranger might be useful after all. "Be aware of one thing, however, Aubergirl," Halt continued. Ragnac looked up at him, surprised at the tone of uncompromising command in his voice. "I'm going to be asking you questions about your establishment, your fighting men, your numbers. They're questions that might give me an advantage in any future disagreement between our two countries."
"I see,"
said Ragnac slowly. He didn't like the direction the conversation was taking. "You'll be tempted to lie to me, to exaggerate your numbers and your abilities. Don't do it." Once more, the Aubergirl was taken aback by the peremptory tone of command, but Halt's gaze was unwavering. "If I am to help you, you'll need to be honest with me, and so will your Jarls." Ragnac considered the statement for a moment or two, then nodded ponderously.
"Agreed,"
he said.
"Mind you,"
he added,
The axe cuts two ways. You'll also be showing us how you think and plan for battle.
And once more, that trace of a smile hovered around Halt's mouth as he acknowledged the Oberjarl's point. That's true, he said. I guess if we want to win, we both have to be willing to lose a little. The two men studied each other once more. Each decided that he liked what he saw in the other's eyes. Abruptly, Ragnac gestured to one of the massive pine-wood armchairs.
Sit down,
he said, indicating a flagon of Gallican wine on the table between them, almost lost in the glittering crystal fittings of the chandelier.
Have a drink and tell me this. Why do you think these Temujai have chosen to make themselves a nuisance in Skandia? Surely the way would have been easier for them to move south through Tutland and Gallica.
Halt poured himself a glass of the brilliant red wine and drank deeply. He raised an eyebrow in appreciation. Ragnac certainly knew the right wines to steal, he thought. I've been wondering that myself, he said at last. He wished the chair he was sitting on was made for someone smaller than the normal massive Skandian build. His feet barely brushed the floor as he sat there, and he felt like a small boy in his father's study. Even if they win here, they must know that you'll be a tough nut to crack. Certainly tougher than the Tootlanders. Ragnac snorted in derision at the mention of the unorganized, squabbling race to the immediate south. Riddled by factions and internecine distrust, the Tootlanders were at the mercy of any would-be conquerors. In fact, if Skandian ambitions had lain in that direction, Ragnac would have felt confident that he could have subjugated the country with his small army of warriors. And the Gallicans are nearly as bad, Halt continued. They'd be almost incapable of agreeing on one overall leader to take command. So I wonder, what is it that made the Temujai swing north and risk a bloody nose here in Skandia?
And?
The Oberjarl prompted. Halt took another swallow of wine and pursed his lips thoughtfully. I asked myself what you had that made the risk worthwhile, he said, and there was only one thing I could think of. He paused. It was a theatrical thing to do, he knew, but he couldn't resist it. As he felt sure would happen, the Oberjarl leaned forward.
What is it? What are they after?
Ships, replied Halt. The Temujai want control of the seas, and that means their ambitions don't stop here. They're planning to invade Araluan as well.